Okay, welcome to the screencast of what Alexander does after his victory at Hydaspes in India. Look, the Greeks were convinced that India was only a small peninsula and that there was not much further to go until they reached the sea, and then they'll be able to sail. Sorry, my head's in the way. Here's India. They'll be able to sail along the coast here and up through the Red Sea and back to Macedonia in a relatively quick journey. This is what the Greeks believed. This is what they were taught of how big India was. It was merely a small peninsula. But you can see by this map, this was the Greek understanding of the world. They had no understanding that Africa was a far bigger continent and that the continent of Asia did not actually end with India, which is what they understood here. But then new frightful information started to come to Alexander that there was 3 weeks march and that wasn't going to get you to the sea. They would only take you to an even bigger river, and there were vast numbers of warlike people, huge army and elephants. Alexander was up against it. There's far more fighting to come. Instead of deciding to turn back, Alexander resolves he's going to push on. But his men have other ideas, and this is what we come to is called the Mutiny at the Bias, which is just here after Hydaspes. Look, his men have had enough, and they just refuse to go any further. They've been fighting for 8 years, nearly 17,000 miles from home. Coinus gives a speech saying, look, we just want to see our families one last time. We love you, Alexander, but we want to go home. Alexander sulked for 3 days in his tent, as he intends to do. But at last, the cries and pleading of his soldiers got out, Plutarch tells us, because they all surrounded his tent and begged him to come out. Such was their love for Alexander. Alexander knew he could go no further, but he couldn't just lose face by agreeing with his men's demand. So he told them he had a dream on the previous night that the gods had told him to turn back, and thus he was going to obey the will of the gods. We can see this connection with Alexander having a convenient dream in order to convince his men to take the city of Tyre, dreaming that Heracles was on the wall beckoning him on. I talked about how to see Alexander's relationship with his men. It was really a relationship, an abusive relationship where Alexander is the abuser manipulating his men. He does something cool. Alexander does. He builds deceptive memorials. So these were normal everyday objects built 3 times the size. You know, extra long spears, extra long shields, swords, beds, sandals, everything, to give future generations the idea that the Macedonians were here and they were giants. He also built huge altars to the gods and sacrificed the gods for making it this far. But it's interesting that his men have just had enough and it is time to go home. So they're heading back? Well, not really. Alexander doesn't just turn around and head back to Babylon. He assures his men we're going to go this way back to Babylon. At this time, Curtius Rufus tells an interesting story that Roxana actually gave birth to a baby son of Alexander's. And either the baby was born dead, stillborn, or died soon after. And Alexander, Curtius says, was forced to dig a hole in the riverbank and bury his son there. Now, it's interesting, if this story is true, one can only imagine the effect this would have had on Alexander's mind, a mind already fairly twisted into paranoia, already killing lots of his former friends, already murderous and mad, as Michael Wood summarises Curtius Rufus. He's just faced a bloody battle, 8 hours of awful fighting. Bucephalus has just died, and his men have just mutinied. And now, if this is true, his baby son has just died and is buried in his own hands. One can imagine the effect on Alexander's mind is not going to be a stabilising one. And in fact, we see his brutality when he butchers the Malian tribe. Now, this was a tribe of people in the area who had no real quarrel with Alexander, and in fact, they didn't really have defended towns. Alexander attacked village after village, and in one village just surrounded it with wood and bush and set fire and burned all the villagers alive. Now, this is a butchery, and this just shows his brutality, I think. And it does give hints that in his grief-stricken mindset, he's got to kill people. We see this after the death of Ophition as well. You could even draw links perhaps from the death of Philip, perhaps not so strongly. Then we have the story of Alexander being wounded fighting the Malian tribe. He was taken on one town which had high fortified walls, and the Macedonians were putting ladders against the walls and trying to climb up, and they were quite unsuccessful because the Malians were able to push the ladders back. Alexander, frustrated, ran to the tallest ladder, scrambled to the top, and leapt onto the wall itself. We know he was athletic. And when he did that, at that moment, all his men were like, oh my God, the king's doing it. They rushed to that ladder and they climbed onto the ladder. But too many of them came, and the weight of them caused the ladder to collapse. So Alexander was marooned on top of this wall, no one behind him, no support, and in front of him, the town full of defenders. Alexander just leapt into the town and started slashing left and right. Now, he had some protection from a tree that he landed by. Fortuitously was on his left-hand side, and none of the defenders were willing to go and take on Alexander toe-to-toe, because to do that would be to die. So Alexander was able to defend himself fairly well, but the inevitable was going to happen because the defenders are firing their arrows and their spears at Alexander. In the meantime, having seen their king disappear from the wall, the Macedonians are panicking, and they've got hundreds of ladders up, and they're scrambling to the top, led by Alexander's generals. As I said, the inevitable happens. An arrow strikes Alexander in the chest, and he goes down. But before the defenders can get to him, one of his leading generals and his friend Perdiccas has made it to the wall. He leaps over and covers Alexander's body with his own. He's wearing armor to protect himself. And so the men are able to get Alexander out, and they massacre the tribe and obviously kill everyone. The army was convinced Alexander was dead. They saw him being carried away on a shield with an arrow through his chest. Alexander was upset and knew that the army needed to see him, and so he ordered his friends to place him onto a barge and go slowly down the river so the army can see. But all that meant was that all the army are thinking as they're looking at Alexander's corpse, and this is a funeral barge. Alexander does raise one hand to signify that he is alive, but only the men who are close up can see it. The rest of the army are convinced that he's dead. Alexander understands this. He puts the needs of his men before his own. He's helped onto his horse, not Bucephalus. Bucephalus is dead, and he's led on the horse in elevated position to his hospital tent so all the army can see him. Alexander does indeed live. And it's quite interesting, this incident, I think, because it kind of puts a line under the mutiny at Baius. It made his men realize how tied they are to Alexander and how grief-stricken they would be if he was separated from them. It really is a manipulative relationship that these men and Alexander are in. Meanwhile, back in Babylon, the rest of Alexander's army are living it up at his expense. They're plundering the temples, they're raping priestesses and noble women, and they're partying all at Alexander's expense. But their real crime, as Theodorus says, is not necessarily what they're doing, although it's bad. Their real crime was that they lost faith in Alexander because they thought he would not return, so they could just go crazy. It's going to be interesting to see what Alexander does when he gets back with these men. Alexander then takes his men through the Gedrosian desert. Perhaps he was seeking the shortest route. Perhaps he wants to open a pathway for supplies. Some historians say he wanted to punish his men for the mutiny at Baius. Don't know about that one, but it's out there. Perhaps just as Pothos. No one else had established a pathway through the Gedrosian desert at all. So perhaps Alexander wants to do that because no one else has done it. We know how this is how he rolls, don't we? And look, I'm just going to summarize here, but Arrian says absolutely dreadful conditions for them to go through the Gedrosian desert. The distress, the heat, the raging thirst was awful. And when they did find water, so many of the men drank too much they died. And then to die of drowning in the desert, this just sucks. They camped by night by a small stream, but then overnight rains, which does happen as we know, caused the stream to flood, and it flooded all the camp followers, the women and the children. Many of them were killed, and many of the supplies were swept away. So it's a disaster going through the Gedrosian, and unclear why Alexander did it, really. And let's go to the Pothos. Look, we do know that his men broke into the royal supplies and distributed them. Alexander turned a blind eye, effective leadership. And he did walk alongside his men, encourage them, and help them. So another sign of effective leadership. The famous water incident, where some of his men found some water in a helmet and gave it to Alexander, encouraging him to drink, and he said, well, is there enough water for everyone else? And they said, no, just you, sire, you should drink it. And he tipped the water onto the sand. And apparently, according to Arrian, the men were so overjoyed at Alexander's caring for them that he's not going to put his own needs above theirs, that they burst into applause and were reinvigorated as they all had a drink of water. True or not, don't know. But it does, I would say this Alexander is just showboating here. He's doing sort of a dramatic effect to try to get his men along with him. I don't know. I don't have too much faith that Alexander was really showing quality leadership here. And so he gets back to Babylon, and as Curtius tells us, he orders 600 of his men to be executed, no trial, executed for living up his expense, sure, but executed, I would say, for losing faith in Alexander, for believing he wasn't going to come back. And Curtius points out that he now is really quick to believe the worst in people and to order execution. Look, he's home now, Babylon anyway. Is he going to really return to Macedonia? Sure, he told his men we're going to, but why is he? A huge new army has come out. He's got a massive army now that come out from Babylon, out from Macedonia, and he's recruited Persians into his army. He's recovered from his wounds, recovered from the journey. There are many more lands to conquer. So, let's carry on maybe. But you know how the gods have always been with Alexander up to this point. I would say now they are starting to desert him. It's a story for another day. Ka kite.